My name is Søren Eskegaard. I'm a professor at the Department of Marketing and Management in the Commerce, Consumption and Culture Research Unit in random order. And I'm very happy to introduce our speaker of the day, Professor Ian Woodward, who is not only a very nice fellow with an irresistible Australian accent, but also a highly valued and valuable part of our research competences. I think it's fair to say that Ian has two major research interests. One is material culture, where in particular his interest in the highly valorized substance of vinyl, which has given birth to a modern consumption icon, has made international impact. We're not going to hear so much about that today, however, but there are a plethora of books and articles you can consult if you're interested in material culture. And the other big research interest of Ian's is cosmopolitanism and globalisation processes. And with those two, I'll leave the word to Ian for explaining what that means, but just concluding by saying that with these two interests and his sociological background, Ian is an incredibly valuable part of our interdisciplinary research community at the Department of Marketing and Management. So welcome, Ian, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I will talk. There's two slides that have got some vinyl references here. I couldn't avoid it. But actually, the first 5 minutes of the presentation, what I wanted to do was to give an introduction to the way in which I frame my research, the types of questions I'm asking, and here you see maybe the relationships between these two fields: materiality studies of material culture, and cosmopolitanism studies. So I think the research that I undertake is united through the concept of value, but not just how we value things in terms of consumption context, but how we value things and people. How do we decide what and who is good or bad or ugly or whatever? How do we admit stuff into our worlds? Who and what belongs in those worlds? Who or what is excluded, and on what principles? I think these are the big questions which unite both of those fields of research so I've mentioned. So my interest in these large questions stem from a broader sociological interest in how what I call symbolic boundaries are made and maintained. These are the routinal judgments and processes of weighing up, the modes and techniques of evaluation of people and things. So sociologists have long been interested, and this is a nice quote from one of the contemporary leaders in symbolic boundary research, Michel Lamont. Sociologists have long been interested in the socio-economic dimensions of differentiation. But relatively recently, they have become also be interested in questions of cultural differentiation. And in doing so, they need a different repertoire, a different language, a different conceptual bank to draw upon, and this is where boundaries come in. So, in my research on consumption, the transitions will be a feature of the talk. In my research on consumption and material culture, which I won't talk about specifically today, unless they intersect with cosmopolitanism studies, which they do to some degree, I've been concerned with these boundary-making processes as expressed through material things and their coordination into systems of symbolic organisation. Decorating the home, a topic I've published it on for the first half dozen or so years of my career, and also the Renaissance, reference one to vinyl, the renaissance of the long-playing vinyl disc. It's a shame Torben's not here. Whenever I look at this photo, I think somehow this is Torben, tending to his vinyl wall. To me, it somehow physically resembles Torben. It's a guy called Klaus Brieler, a Berlin-based musician. But anyway, that's another story. In my research on cosmopolitanism, for me, the key question is how we make sense of our expanded worlds. Where do we draw the boundaries now that these worlds are relatively open-ended? And also whether or not we begin to develop feelings of widening responsibility for strangers, for environments far away from us, to seek to understand and be changed by incorporating the viewpoints and worldviews apparently very much like our own. So here, to put it simply, is a big question. Does globalisation make us globalists? Are we just more mobile in various ways, or more omnivorous in our consumption habits, while still maintaining a narrow sense of who and where and who else, who and what belong and where, and who else is right to live with us and around us? Or do globalisation processes encourage us to take a global view? Okay, so the idea of cosmopolitanism seems to have a good deal of mileage to run, at least that's how I would like to see it, even though we've seen about 10 years of intense expanding research in the field. It's now evident in most areas of the social sciences and humanities. Part of its attraction, the concept at least, is in the sheer diversity of its applications. Urban studies, music studies, aesthetics, studies of everyday intercultural practices and exchange. Not only might cosmopolitanism be seen as a successor, or perhaps more accurately, as an ethical and cultural extension to globalisation theory, but it comes to describe a key aspect of social experience that's apparently more frequently encountered due to the mobility of people and things. Difference is ubiquitous, mobility of various sorts and for various reasons is routine, and cultural diversity is commonplace. What principles inform social interactions in these contexts? So the cosmopolitan question is, in what ways might these things matter for belonging, identity, obligation and incorporation of diverse cultures and perspectives? Do they introduce a unique and vanguard dynamic of social change? And do they also demand a new ethical approach? Is there a cosmopolitan possibility, a space of social encounter, where cosmopolitan consequences come into play? And in this talk, in much of my research empirically, though it's obviously a multi-dimensional concept, for me, cosmopolitanism works best when it helps us or me to understand why and how we feel connected to others, what obligations we feel we owe them, how our sense of belonging might be expanded under conditions of widening circles of social contact. In short, it alerts us to the relationality and negotiation inherent in the dynamic complexities of global social life. So, just to give you a bit more of an appreciation of how literatures on the topic of cosmopolitanism have differentiated, I can say that there are maybe 4 big dimensions to the way in which philosophers and sociologists have talked about cosmopolitanism: the political, the ethical, the methodological, and the cultural. I'm an expert on some of these, more than others. But in terms of political, the cosmopolitan impulse is about encouraging and appreciating and recognising difference, embedding our politics in universal principles, committing ourselves to the dethronement of our own unique cultural identity. At a global level, this political impulse plays out in terms of regimes of global governance, legal institutional frameworks for regulating events and processes which are beyond the scope of any one nation. Ethically, cosmopolitanism is about worldliness, hospitality and communitarianism. Inclusivity here becomes the key principle. Methodologically, and this is, I guess, the argument of Beck, is that contemporary sociology needs a new language. Contemporary social sciences need a new language. At the core of this methodological argument is the claim, or the statement, that it's not necessarily about the rejection of the nation-state's importance and relevance, but rather about the embrace of a post-national and transnational perspective in understanding the forces of globality. The political and practical relevance of this move to become methodologically cosmopolitan is that social analysis opens up to the relational processes which bind the local to the global, universal in particular, familiar and other. The result, it's hoped, is a social science which is better attuned to accurately describe the processes which form and structure the contemporary world. Culturally, which is where most of my research has been situated, the concept of openness becomes a key idea in this field of research. Working with my co-authors, we once remarked that this emphasis on openness could sound nebulous and trite, but there's little doubt that a disposition of openness is a basic philosophical posture underpinning cosmopolitanism and a basic dispositional characteristic that most theorists of cosmopolitanism agree on. The conception of cosmopolitanism as a form of openness is an epistemological principle underpinning cosmopolitanism. It limits and fixates the definitional horizon by reminding us that beyond openness lies a sphere or apparent sphere of all things uncosmopolitan. So, what makes cosmopolitan? What makes the global? What makes the global? But what also affords the type of development of a cosmopolitan way of looking at social events? Well, firstly, we can point to iconic representations of the global. These are famous images from Apollo 11 called Earthrise. So here it's about technological revolutions that can fundamentally alter our own perceptions of our worlds. Visual and optic dimensions of globality point to particular intensive phases of time-space compression. This allows us to see our world differently. Secondly, things like this, material and material infrastructures of the global. I took this approximately 48 hours ago, showing flights over Europe, Northern Africa, Eastern Europe and the Atlantic and so on. But you can see at that stage there were 13,000 air flights around the globe, at least ones that were able to be picked up on this radar, flight radar 24. And this snapshot shows 1,500 of those flights. So these particular types of technological and materially structured forms of globalisation tell us an important story about social economic dynamics and also national dimensions of the global. This also, these architectures of the global also afford the development of cosmopolitan types of ways of thinking about the world. Second reference to vinyl. You can talk about material, cultural, and consumptive dimensions of the global. Various market agents, these are reissues by a well-known vinyl label based in Berlin, Analog Africa. And this is not the only example, but it's one of the best. The way in which various types of market agents and market actors recover, heritagize, and diffuse various new old sounds from different parts of the world to new audiences who embrace these sounds, and they become part of a sort of a cosmopolitan consumption scape. And also, various types of debates that circulate in news. So mobilities of various sorts, exchanges of people, ideas and things, changing consciousness in terms of the global. Social status systems based around demonstrating openness and civility. The practicalities of getting along in the world demand it, and many people actively embrace it, but some don't. What's the relation between globalisation and cosmopolitanism, and what experiential and social pathways make people open to appreciating and competently dealing with difference? For me, this is the basic question of key research strands in the field of cosmopolitanism. Does globality invite and necessitate a reorientation of boundaries and borders? And what are the processes socially, and what are the processes and dynamics around this tension? Okay. So, what Cosmo is and what it is not. So it's a political and ethical ideal. We might say cosmopolitanism is the political and ethical ideal dimension of the term. But it's also a real social process, cosmopolitanisation. A process whereby the global comes to influence and reframe the local. Globalisation does not guarantee cosmopolitanism. Globalisation doesn't necessarily guarantee globalisation anyway, right? But in addition to globalisation's economic and integrative emphasis, cosmopolitanism introduces particular sets of globally oriented ethical principles and political practices. Cosmopolitan society, at least sociologically, is not a given, but a process and a project. It's not about replacing the nation state, but an incorporation of the nation state into regional and global processes and context. It's not here to save the world, necessarily, though its promise, and this is one of the attractions of the concept, its promise is about social hope, political transformation, and intellectual revitalisation in the social sciences. Okay. Okay, note on method, or a couple of notes on method and approach. So my work on cosmopolitanism consists of theoretical pieces, but also quite a number of empirical papers, mostly in small teams, and always involving a good colleague of mine, Zlatko Skribish, well, virtually always. Lately then, also a small team of postgraduate students and postdocs, at least in the Australian context from which I've come. Methodologically, I use mostly qualitative approaches, interviews, focus groups, visual and material methods, but I've also, in a couple of papers, used quantitative survey methods based on representative samples when they're available. In my qualitative work, I use a key conceptual framework which operates at the point between cultural and cognitive research. A key methodology fixes around what I go on to explain through a bundle of related concepts, alluding to this idea of symbolic boundaries I referred to earlier, around boundaries, categories, and schemas. The general idea of symbolic boundaries is that they're conceptual distinctions that people use to categorize objects, other people, practices, and even times and spaces. This has been at the heart of sort of underlying methodological framework of my work. Symbolic boundaries are tools by which individuals and groups distinguish between the things which they deem good or bad. Examining them allows us to capture the dynamic dimensions of social relations as groups compete in the production, diffusion, and institutionalization of alternative systems and principles of classifications. Symbolic boundaries also separate people into groups and generate feelings of similarity in group membership, which have implications for how social and economic capitals are distributed. In some of my research published, we've also used the idea of cognitive schema from the field of cognitive sociology as a point of methodological orientation. Cognitive schemas have been referred to as knowledge structures, clusters of ideas for thinking with, which individuals use to simplify and systematize knowledge about social life and determine pathways for social action. They form part of the culturally structured cognitive architecture of symbolic boundaries. As such, the multiplicity of vocabularies and semantic repertoires deployed by people reveal aspects of how they structure the world in their mind, as well as pointing to how they engage with it practically. As part of our work within the schema approach, we've also used drawn upon Zerubbabel's theory of lumping and splitting. This gives you a sense of one of the operational concepts that we've used in the research. Lumping refers to the grouping of acts, events, objects, people, and traits, allowing the actual or perceived differences or similarities between items, actually the actual perceived similarities to outweigh the differences. So things are lumped together. This cognitive practice in the cosmopolitan context can enable performances of openness because people tend to lump groups together and reduce boundaries become less important as groups are lumped together. Splitting, on the other hand, is the opposite process, widens the perceived difference between cognitive clusters, which are in fact things that have real social effects, and facilitates a more limited or closed mode of engagement to splitting. Therefore, as people habitually perform this cognitive work, they develop and manage flexible and changing codes for symbolically and practically engaging with others. And also, more recently, in a project that's finished but still being published from, we've drawn on the idea of social encounters, partly inspired by Gerard Delanty's work, partly. We also developed the idea somewhat independently. More methodologically, I've set out to study encounters between different social agents and actors in order to understand their cosmopolitan consequences. So the concept of cosmopolitan encounter refers to tangible, experiential, and contextual encounters with cultural difference. It unites the everyday analysis of streetscapes, spaces, bodies, and practices with the macro dimensions of civil society, obligation, generosity, hospitality, and belonging. The idea of cosmopolitan encounter can be used to describe the zones and episodes of contacts between individuals and other people, objects, events, and settings which are culturally different to themselves. Encounters become types of test cases, we saw, how we framed it at least, for the durability and robustness of cosmopolitan values and practices, challenging, extending, confirming, or diminishing people's willingnesses to exhibit types of cosmopolitan generosity in the face of real-world dilemmas. So as explored in studies of everyday cosmopolitanism and ordinary cosmopolitanism, such encounters are not limited to elite settings, but take place in ordinary contexts, the street, public transport, shops, food courts, homes, workplaces. Such encounters are common events in plural multicultural democracies, and they form a fundamental dimension of everyday lives within the context of contemporary societies. Well, it's a beautiful day in Denmark, but it was always a beautiful day in Australia when we did this fieldwork. There's a lot more detail here, but it gives you a sense. We have, I have collected a lot of data on these sorts of issues over the years, but this project was the biggest, and as I said, just completed a couple of years ago. We're still publishing from it. And we had data collection in 10 locations in Australia, so it was myself and Zlatko Skribish with a group of assistants and postdocs and so on, with a qualitative methodology generally, right? Semi-structured interviews, focus groups, had a minor ethnographic dimension. So we interviewed up to around 180 people in towns like Bendigo, regional town north of Melbourne, with a gold mining history, a history of Chinese immigration. This is Broome up the northwest of Australia, remote northwest. On one side you have Asia, on the other side you have the desert and indigenous, a large indigenous population. Perth, apparently, arguably, the most isolated city in the world, right? Maybe the most boring, I'm not sure. We'll see. No need to go back to Perth necessarily, anyway. But Cairns as well, in northern Queensland, tropical. Right? We also went to Darwin, we went to farming regions, so on and so forth, right? So, there's more detail, but at least that gives you a sense. So, I will attempt a little bit of the impossible and take you through some of the empirical findings in this project, and also some earlier research into the same sort of topics. At least try and sum up some of the key themes which attend to answering this question about the impacts of globalisation on cosmopolitan outlooks. And in a way, all of the themes I will talk about offer some type of commentary on how people frame the global and reframe the global, the political, cultural, ethical dimensions of their perception of the global. Okay, this first one takes us back to, well, actually, this was almost preparatory fieldwork for a larger project. Even so, we undertook a study maybe 10 years ago now, which was our first empirical foray into the topic of globalisation, cosmopolitanism. One of the key and inconsistent findings, and so these are quotes, right? So you have to believe in qualitative research, interview research. You have to think not necessarily from academic standpoints, but you have to think in terms of everyday language, everyday settings, and so forth, right? So I've just taken out some key quotes, and these key quotes are meant to illustrate various types of approaches, but they're all in published papers, all right? So they're all drawn from larger papers where the theory and so on is much more fleshed out. But one of the key and consistent findings is that people relates to the perceived personal economic freedoms and benefits afforded by globalisation, especially within fields of consumption. This is where cosmopolitanism and consumption come together. The understanding of the global as something experienced through consumptive possibilities is the most dominant positive discourse that we found related to globalisation, but it does entail some contradictions. In the first instance, it's really about choice. Choice was a key word here for people. Maybe it's not in this quote, but the ethos of choice is here. For our participants, globalisation means that there is now a vast supermarket of goods, images and services that can be accessed locally, or for that matter, irrespective of location, this first quote. But the linking of globalisation with opportunities in the economic domain is only one aspect of the story. There's also a significant downside with strong political consequences. And when research participants were asked to say what comes to their mind when they think of globalisation, they thought about this stuff, oysters, wine, cheese, but they also thought about domination, big companies, commercialisation, Americanisation, and the stories of the corner shop. They were able to sort of, they drew upon discourses which contrasted the local, the small scale, with the global. So they cannot compete with the globalisation of markets. This is a bad thing, this is for Australia, but the same thing in Denmark, I would guess. Netto and Irma buy in bulk thousands and thousands of items, but your corner shop can't compete. This has affected the Australian economy. It's been a lot. It's in the time I've been alive, I've seen it just go down and down. This becomes a negative side of globalisation. A further set of positive capacities for openness is associated with globalisation in terms of opening one's eyes to other cultural styles and possibilities. In this sense, and in this quote, it's the most pure cosmopolitan sentiment, emphasising learning about other cultures for its own sake, and a sort of a utopian expression of the idea that we can live in a world of borderless free exchanges. This comment is exceptional, but best sums up the idea that globalisation can foster genuine cosmopolitan mixing. But there's also a downside. So people tended to think in binaries. At the same time that people would put the positives, wine, cheese, free exchange, people would also put the negatives to us. And so we saw the global frame through this type of dynamic and relational binary. This is a student who was studying drama, and she said, in my third year, we'll have to speak American. This is what global culture is doing to us. Yeah, sorry. Just so that we can get work in Australia, we have to speak American. So we're losing our voice, right? So the locals being sort of obliterated. This is what Tony Collette said. We're going to lose the Australian voice. And it's not just the Australian voice, but this became a sort of a metaphor, if you like, for Australian culture more broadly, for the local and the national. So we framed this through the idea of the ambivalence of ordinary cosmopolitanism. And this was also tested in a quantitative paper. We came up with the same sort of findings. We had a representative sample called the Australian, what's it called? Political Science Survey, representative samples of Australians. And it showed that everyday ideas about openness, as expressed within the talk of our participants, suggested a brittle form of cosmopolitanism, what we call a brittle form. It's fractured by deeply structured feelings and allegiances regarding self and others, benefits and dangers, local and global, which all seem to inhibit the expression of cosmopolitan openness. Moreover, ideas about openness are strongly linked to positive experiences, frequently based in what we might see as relatively easy behavioural repertoires of the cosmopolitan disposition. Vinyl records, food consumption, overseas travel, music. Openness is therefore most likely to be endorsed as a feature of the global world when it's associated with enjoyable experiences that cultivate one's own identity, when they offer fulfilling experiences, and when they are based on a rather superficial engagement with another culture from a smorgasbord of global possibilities. At the same time, they are negatively coded when they are experienced as an engagement with other cultures that is perceived to be threatening or challenging. So this sort of gave us this empirical take, informed a relatively pessimistic story about cosmopolitanism, at least in the context of the sample. So cosmopolitanism is not necessarily best imagined as an emergent world system that's borderless, utopian and expression of universal values, but rather a set of increasingly available cultural outlooks that individuals selectively deploy to deal with new social conditions. In this sense, it can be seen as a type of cultural capital and also a repertoire selectively deployed rather than something fixed. The process of global valuing was dynamic and relational. I'm going to skip through this. In another paper, we looked at various types of schemas based around what we call knowledge and learning-based schemas. So the way in which people narrated their learning with other cultures, and sometimes people based it around certain types of learning of knowledge, so being certain types of exposures, and sometimes people use schemas based around what we call visceral, which means embodied, or experiential, and we talked in the terms of Levinas and the face. So the role of the face-to-face encounter in encouraging a type of cosmopolitan empathy or cosmopolitan ethic. Long quotes, and the paper, that point itself is not that interesting, but it is interesting when we introduce a gender dimension. I think this is, if I can find my slide, a fascinating dimension of the data. Generally speaking, individuals, so you can see the female and male quotes, individuals seem to play a more central role as bearers of faces in female women's schemas of openness. We reach this conclusion by mapping, identifying the cognitive schemas that women use for thinking about difference, and they often contain keywords or topics suggesting a perceived closeness or imagined solidarity through metaphors of care, interpersonal valuing and domesticity, such as mother, family, home, child, as well as universalistic concepts such as care, empathy, compassion, equality. And you can see that this philosophy, this type of practical ethic is illustrated nicely in these couple of quotes. I love the way they look after their family. It's all about love. We all want to be loved. We've all got the same bodies, therefore we should all be able to get along with each other. But it's sort of based around, these discourses about care, compassion, empathy and equality. According to our findings, but male cognitive schemas tended to assign the duty of hospitality outside the individual. Women's language was based around care, face interactions and so on. Men tended to externalise this responsibility as something to be just institutionally guaranteed or institutionally managed. Appropriate forms of welcoming strangers and fairness are thus not an individual's responsibility, but the task of an organisation or the state. One particularly clear example of this was presented to us by a male in his 30s who emphasised the importance of infrastructure, legal institutional arrangements, having a good system in place to welcome strangers. When asked if he had any feelings regarding whether Australia was obliged to take in foreigners or not, he replied that Australia must do so within the context of UN conventions or whatever. Similarly, sounds like Donald Trump the way I said that, but you get the point. Similarly, a male in his, partly it's a Trumpian philosophy, similarly a male in his 60s observes the movements of migrants and refugees within social structures and legal frameworks, using his personal knowledge of refugees, supposed personal knowledge, to argue for better systems of checking up. So these are sort of legal discourses. We interpret that men's inclination to situate the other in a category distant from the self has two important implications. Firstly, feelings of difference and distance enable a suspension of emotion-laden judgments and enable one to argue in favour of institutionally defined processes and power structures. Something that I don't have personal responsibility for, someone else looks after that. These are legal matters, not about how I should deal with people. Secondly, assigning another person to an island of cognitive meaning, in the language of the methodology, separate from the self, increases the evaluation of them as not being entitled to freely enter Australia without this being perceived as the infiltration of strangers. Similarly, this gender distinction was found to impact on our interviewees' perspectives on the conditionality of hospitality. More specifically, the men in our sample more frequently express symbolic ownership over the nation, in various ways stating, as an elderly male did in our sample, that this is my bloody country. One possible explanation for this is that masculine status, power and cultural value is traditionally property dependent and accumulated through repertoires for managing and controlling property, including, in this case, monopolising dominant narratives of the nation as something owned by certain groups. Okay, and this, again, all of these, and this is in a paper just published last year, I think, about cosmopolitanism and gender. And another theme that comes up in the data, and also another paper, relates to the way in which cosmopolitan types of outlooks to openness become entangled with nationalism. The frame of the nation returns as an anchoring device that bites back in times of social stress. So cutting across and tying these different conceptualizations of belonging to Australia, or the nation, was the popular notion of the fair go, which is the sort of everyday ideology in the Australian social context. The way our participants described the fair go revolved around being open. You're open, you're accepting, you give everyone a fair shot. You're always ready to help, lend to help, to give a helping hand. Speaking to ideas about mateship and national idols like the Anzac or the Battler. As such, these ideals about what it means to be Australian might correspond to the values associated with cosmopolitan ethics, and in fact, until they are pushed, they seem to serve the purpose to imagine bonds of solidarity between and across strangers. However, a closer look at how Australianness' fairness inflected micro-level interactions with those perceived as culturally different revealed the tenuous relation in which cosmopolitanism and nationalism were situated. Narratives about Australianness were both mobilised in favour of embracing diversity, the fair go, but they also became the narrative means for setting conditions attached to hospitality and conviviality. So this fair go ethos seemed open and friendly and so on, until you come up against certain situations where that same discourse can be turned on its head from being something which is inclusive to being something exclusivist. Yeah, okay, I've probably summed that up well enough. So our findings highlight, and you can look at some of these quotes, but I'll sum it up for you. Our findings here highlight the uneasy relationship between national and cosmopolitan values. We found that national and cosmopolitan values overlap or coincide when intersecting or interacting in safe or sanitized social settings. However, when confronted with dangerous or uncomfortable diversities, the national discourse of the fair go served to mobilize boundaries rather than bridge experiences. The mythology of belonging around fairness and mateship was not universal, as the ideals might suggest, but indeed exclusivist, and their meaning was relatively easily switched and inverted. In fact, and these lower bottom quotes illustrate, in fact, some participants used the fair go discourse to argue for better treatment of white Australians. Okay. Yeah. Heading toward the end, but I think we've got plenty of time, so I can just relax. Okay. So, and another paper. We also looked at what it means for our participants to get along, how they understood getting along in multicultural settings. As the same, one participant described to us his understanding of participating in a diverse work environment. And, excuse the blatant racism, but anyone who interviews people, once you talk to people about everyday life stuff, they say, lots of stuff just pours out, right? So, which is what we're interested in. So our data consisted of many examples of exposure to difference that were not voluntary, and in fact were very tense or required great effort to negotiate. And we were interested in this question of how people negotiate difference in everyday settings. Rather than dismissing such encounters as void of cosmopolitan potential, such instances became highly useful for examining the terms of engagement, the types of social relations and other influences that could assist or hinder deeper forms of openness. The following participant, I think this is the second quote, whose volunteering practice is guided by her desire to help others, exposed her to more challenging encounters. She demonstrated cosmopolitan dispositions around mobility and obligation of care for others, but what drew our attention to her narrative was how such individual openness comes with certain limits and conditions, in this case around perceptions of the body, cleanliness, self-presentation. They just don't have the same level of cleanliness. I want to help them. I think that we could help them to attain that, but I'm not sure that that's what they want. I want to be open to these people. I would help them do anything they wanted, but there are some parts of the way in which they're performing everyday civilities which is offensive and somehow is counter to the norms, to social norms. So encounters with diversity take place in a multitude of settings and can involve a range of performances and emotional responses. We analysed how participants framed their encounters with diversity, what triggered feelings of discomfort, cleanliness, and how they managed these. Many participants describe short encounters and everyday concepts like this one. When you go out and you might walk past someone that you don't know and give them a general little smile, I just find a lot of them don't even seem to look sideways or be interested. These are narrations of encounters. It's give them a smile. I don't see a person for what colour skin they have or anything like that. I'll smile at anyone if I make eye contact, but I just don't get that friendliness back. So this brief narrative about casual encounters in neighbourhoods is indicative of many others in our data. The participant was unable to explain to herself why her friendly gesture was not reciprocated, while emphasising that she would treat everybody else equally. People should smile at each other. We observed consistently that narratives about encounters that were experienced as unpleasant were linked to disclaimers such as this, reflecting what has been referred to by others as a type of race talk. Participants felt that they made efforts that were not reciprocated. The ground rules of civilities were not followed, norms of civilities were breached, and as in this case, participants frequently described bad feelings, even though encounters were mostly transient. These were experiences that they narrated, which stuck in their minds. They take place in public transports, taxis. Taxis were a difficult zone for people to negotiate, at shops, or just passing others in the street. So, as a tendency, we observe, before I maybe just describe this section, one of the things we asked people to do was to rank themselves, self-rank themselves on an openness scale from 1 to 10 or 0 to 10, I can't remember. 10 being the most open and 0 being the most closed. And then we asked them why. We asked them to narrate why they scored themselves at that point and so on. So as a tendency, we observed that participants who engaged in conviviality practices and frequently experienced encounters with diversity ranked themselves consistently lower. They were likely to give themselves a lower score on the self-ranked openness scale. We found that often they reflected more on their own attitudes, practices and positions within racialized relationships and judged themselves more harshly when reporting their openness to diversity. Why? So it's exemplified in, I think, extract 1. I do have some ingrained racism that I do fight, this idea of resisting one's impulses. Okay, you gave us an 8, yeah, because I fight it. Other people let it creep along and don't reflect on it. I reflect on it. They don't. They won't challenge their own behaviour about their own actions. I'm willing to admit, but I'm also willing to be reflexive about it. With similar hesitation about ranking themselves too highly, another participant who referred to herself as parochial scored herself a level of 7 out of 10 and described a cathartic experience when travelling. Her development of a new sensitivity to notions of race that included thinking or rethinking herself in racialized terms. This is the first time I ever felt like a white woman. I really felt it. Oh my God, I'm a white woman. I never felt the colour of my skin before. It's just like, what are you talking about? People are people. So this reflexivity was an important dimension of the development of cosmopolitan ethic. Paradoxically, efforts to embrace openness in a profound way were often accompanied by bad feelings, anxiety, insecurity, guilt, rather than experienced as pleasant or enriching. Often experiences and views such as these were associated with the acquisition of cross-cultural knowledge and skills. So when I was at a coffee shop, I got offended. Some people, they'd hand you the money, and when you went to give them the change, they'd take the hand away. I thought, how rude is this? But it's not that, it's because you don't touch hands with somebody else you're not close to. When somebody told me, when I learnt about this, I thought, okay, cool. So this leads us to distinguish, or to make a distinction between a distinction about circumstantial encounters. What we came to distinguish as cosmopolitan encounters were typically characterised by individuals' own reflexive engagement with oneself and with the other, guided by ethical principles which prevent unilateral impositions or interpretations of the situation, as exemplified in this quote. Okay. Have I explained that well enough? Good enough. Again, I'll give you a list of sources at the end. You can read a bit more about it. Heading toward a conclusion. So we can conceptualise these discussions. If I want to think about what all this research is about, it's really about deliberations on the civil sphere. For me, in a big picture at least, this is the way I'm thinking about it, perhaps into the future, where ideas about race, ethnicity and value constitute a collective valuing of difference and diversity. So in these studies, we aim to get a better understanding of encounters in diverse societies. Our findings show that contradictions in attitudes and practices are common. Not only do individuals in their practices lag behind the cosmopolitan outlooks they sometimes profess, but we also found individuals who express racist self-perceptions or do not think of themselves as cosmopolitan, but nonetheless successfully negotiated encounters with others. So we found these intriguing paradoxes. Not that we expect to define pure forms of cosmopolitanism, but it's interesting to look at the fracturing, the fragmentation of these types of cosmopolitan solidarities. So while our findings reaffirm the conceptualization of cosmopolitanism as performances within encounters, rather than an identity that is acted on consistently, it also raises the question of what, in fact, makes such encounters cosmopolitan and what role the subjectivities play in this. So we aren't always sure what cosmopolitan performances or identities are, what they do and what outcomes they have. We're beginning to understand, at least this is speaking personally, that there are different ways of being cosmopolitan, that it might be the case that not all of these ways are equally cosmopolitan. It's important to make distinctions, and that there are different motivations for acting in cosmopolitan ways. And moreover, that all the time these cosmopolitan actions get entangled with other powerful social structures. Gender, socioeconomic location, distinctions of social status. These can always distort and influence the effects of intended cosmopolitan solidarities in perverse ways. We argue that not all encounters with diversity qualify as cosmopolitan just because people incidentally from different backgrounds people with different backgrounds fleetingly congregate in transient social settings, or tolerate each other's presence, and thereby challenge the notion that exposure will eventually overcome prejudice. We respond to critiques of everyday cosmopolitanism as the cosmopolitanisation of everything, by seeking to analytically and empirically define the characteristics of cosmopolitan encounters. This is what we tried to do in this body of recent papers. So within our own participants' narratives, two crucial dimensions emerge, which we develop in turn. One is reflexivity in everyday engagements, and one is an ethical framework based on the principle of sharing. Let me sum up. Reflexive engagement in encounters with diversity relates to the cosmopolitan disposition of openness. Rather than evidence for cosmopolitan self-fashioning, we found that narratives of encounters were often subtly framed in terms of performing whiteness in the Australian context and dominance, and understood in terms of controlling or managing difference, rather than more or less successfully by assuming normative power in encounters. Participants were often aware of their own positionality and enacted racial scripts unintentionally. This, however, resulted in encounters that reproduced and confirmed racialised subjectivities rather than enabled cosmopolitan self-fashioning. However, a minority of participants described sentiments of being and becoming more aware of their own positionality, and in these instances we can see the sort of the expression, the birth of a cosmopolitan type of sensibility. Often these processes, as I've said, were accompanied by insecurities, anxieties and critical reflections on the self, leading to a deeper reflexive engagement with diversity. We believe that such feelings to some extent stem from the perception of the structural limitations imposed on enacting cosmopolitan scripts. In other words, participants engage in a type of reverse race talk, in which I am you know the expression I am racist but, in fact means to say my social reality is racialised but, followed by a statement describing cosmopolitan practices or attitudes. Consequently, we found that participants who acknowledged rather than denied the existence of cultural differences were more willing to reflect on their positionality in encounters. This reflexivity was often accompanied by anxieties about being judged or seeming racist. So the findings of our study imply a critique of reductionist definitions of cosmopolitanism in terms of hospitality and tolerance. Hospitality forms part of the cosmopolitan disposition, but the concept is based on a relationship in terms of guest and host, one person extending a hand, the other agreeing to the conditions attached by an invitation. Cosmopolitan conviviality needs to move beyond selective and controlled situations of giving spaces to belong or means to subsist at a distance to facilitate truly equal encounters, whatever that might be. This requires a cosmopolitan ethic based on sharing. This notion of sharing was important. Sharing the power to set rules for exchanges, sharing the right to perform culturally distinct practices, sharing experiences, both good and bad, with one another. This is socially and collectively difficult. So we distinguish the ethical reasoning our participants draw upon from existing models such as the ethics of care proposed by Gassenhage, as we do not see it derived from a particular type of relationship to the nation state, nor do we see this, nor do we simply expand this framework to a community conceptualized as transnational or universal. Instead, we insist that for encounters to be deemed cosmopolitan, the requirement of reflexive engagement, which opens up spaces of being changed, paired with an ethical framework centred on sharing, becomes the key way of performing the types of cosmopolitan conviviality. Sharing comprises the acknowledgement and respect towards cultural idiosyncrasies within a relationship in which normative power is held between all parties involved. Furthermore, sharing is different from giving or helping in that it better facilitates opportunities for unconditional relationality rather than managing or controlling cultural diversity. This includes the accumulation of cross-cultural knowledge and communication skills and the ongoing interrogation of prejudices, stereotypes and self. Crucially, such reasoning acknowledges cosmopolitan outcomes as potential for every encounter within diversity that is uncertain and needs to be worked on, a type of emotional work in every instance by the individuals involved. So our findings bring new questions to the agenda of research in the field of everyday cosmopolitanism as a theoretical framework and an empirical project. If the possibility of a cosmopolitan encounter rests on reflexive engagement and ethical reasoning based on sharing, then we need to better understand the conditions under which these are likely to be socially realised. This may, personally, I think that this might include closer attention to what makes cosmoscapes or cosmopolitan canopies distinct, to enable us to ask how to expand the institutional conditions in which forms of cosmopolitanism will naturally thrive. Furthermore, we also need to ask about how cosmopolitan values around sharing and fairness are reflected within national discourses around similar principles are reflected by national discourses. And on that note, I will finish. But the top, so here, yeah, you do. This is some of my favourite books on cosmopolitanism, which if you're interested in the topic, you should look at. Beck, of course, Delante, but there are others up there. And then this is some of the material that the presentation today is drawn from, mostly empirical pieces, but yeah, ignore them or check some of them out. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Me first?
Yes,
Wow,
you're
okay.
first.
Thank you, Ian. That was really interesting. And I love all of the raw data, but I really would like to hear more about, well, I could borrow from Søren, the context of context. You know, more of a what is the public discourse? What are the kind of media narratives that are happening? And I think that I thought about this because I'm sure you heard about the scandal in New Zealand, a neighboring country, with the the Polynesian man who's a director who's characterized New Zealand as racist as fuck.
Oh, yeah.
And there's been a huge reaction. And
Yeah.
it very much seems like New Zealand having a self-identity as a more cosmopolitan country and having this really strong reaction to this public attack, that they perceive. So I wonder if there's similar things, or there are conversations like that happening in Australia?
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a media researcher, and I've always tried to, as a sociologist, I've been interested in everyday practices and everyday engagements. And yeah, so in the papers that we've done, the research that we've done, we really haven't focused on the context and so on. Yeah, of course, we need to study history. We need to study some of the circulation of media narratives and media events, but we haven't analysed those closely. They come up in the conversations we have with participants, and they clearly inform some of the ways in which people are thinking about the global, right? So, yeah, it's in the data, it's in the way people narrate, and the way people talk about it. But for me, I've always been interested more in everyday practices and everyday negotiations, rather than studying media discourses. But having said that, I think, yeah, you can imagine some interesting projects around museums. Festivals is a project I'm thinking about, or trying to get underway at the moment. Sorts of contexts for the expression of cosmopolitan sensibilities. This is interesting. Here, for me, it's often about or the way I'm thinking about it is through this idea of material spatial architectures and the way in which particular types of social spatial settings afford, generate, allow certain types of cosmopolitan expressions. This is an idea that has been expressed in various theoretical pieces through my research in this topic, but not always thoroughly empirically interrogated. So this is something I think would be worth looking at. With the vinyl project, we did look at the circulation of vinyl in certain types of cosmopolitan spaces in cities. This is maybe context of context. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there, but
Thank you.
thanks.
Yeah, I understood you as saying that this is somehow a historical kind of unique development, and if so, I would like to challenge that idea a bit. I mean, hasn't there always been various attempts, ideologies, ethical projects to unite humanity on the basis of equality, sharing, particular idea of progress and unity. I'm thinking of the Communist International. I'm thinking of the Ummah, the community of believers, or every religion has a sort of, these, and actually the same principles of equality in that community, the sharing, the ethical standard. And I actually, and if we spin that forward and all of that, they all, put up sort of paradoxically high ideals of equality that necessarily leads to failure, and then they invent a ritual where you have to sort of confess your sins or your failing, that, confess your racism, confess your failings as a believer, confess your failings as a worker and a champion of the working class, etc. They all, then find their enemies, and in some ways even.
Sure.
So far, all of them have turned into an empirical, some sort of project of empire. I don't know if we're going to see that here, but isn't that, wouldn't that sort of comparative perspective be interesting instead of saying this is a unique moment?
Yeah, you started out saying that I painted this that I suggested this was an historically unique setting, and then you suggested, but I don't think I necessarily started there by articulating that belief, right? By articulating that point of view. We got into this research because we were upset at the way in which theorists, philosophers, had been using the idea of cosmopolitanism as some sort of this thing that had just that had been around for thousands of years, but near the end of the millennium, it was somehow apparent that this could become a reality. And of course, we started with this sort of sociological skepticism that this probably was rubbish, and we wanted to interrogate different ways in which that played out in social settings and encounters in objects and space and so on. So maybe if I presented it as historically unique, maybe that's because maybe someone like Ulrich Beck has tended to play on this idea, right? So no, I wouldn't see it that way. That said, I'm not an historian, and so I've never really, I must say, been interested in following this idea back and looking at its expression in particular in historical settings. So one of the books I love is Mika Naba's book. It's about gender and cosmopolitanism, but it's also about visceral cosmopolitanism. And she looks at the ways in which certain types of cosmopolitan sensibilities emerge in the context of British modernism, 19th century modernism, early 20th century modernism. One of her famous papers is about Selfridge's department store. I mean, I've never really been interested in that type of historical perspective, but it's something many people do. Again, I tend to focus on the sociological mundanities about how people talk, what they do, and the types of object engagements they have. A critique of that is of course, it's not sufficiently historically informed. Yeah.
Yeah, you say the enemies of the cosmopolitan society.
Yes, I don't think I mentioned that word in my talk.
But is there potent danger to the globalized world?
Is there?
Yeah, is there?
Yeah. So it's reflecting back on some of this research. Some of the research we did 10 years ago, or it was published 10 years ago, and it picks up on processes which have become much more stronger in recent times, right? So we noticed way back, like 10 or 15 years ago in the Australian context, maybe not 15, but 10 or 12 years ago, that there were these sort of latent expressions of resistance to global processes, resistance to refugees, resistance, this sort of idea that globalisation was affecting the nation, was affecting Australia or Denmark or whatever. So yeah, we picked up on this stuff. We didn't actually strongly frame it, but with events in the world turning as they are now, yeah, you can see that the types of things that we've picked up on have become more and more evident actually in recent times. The enemies of cosmopolitanism. This is Beck's phrase, but I've never not necessarily systematically dealt with the idea. But what I see is that many of our empirical findings tend to pick up on the types of resistances to cosmopolitan solidarities. And in this sense, they can be seen as the type of enemies to the flowering of a fully formed cosmopolitan sensibility. That's how I use the term enemies, drawing upon Beck. But of course, the enemies for us should be apparent in the types of empirical settings I've described. Threats to the nation, threats to the national economy, threats to national culture, threats to my well-being. These are the types of everyday enemies of cosmopolitan expressions. And they come up there. This is a consistent finding in the data. So then the question is, what to do about it. But it's not something I can answer right now, I guess. Does that?
Well, also, do you think these are just contemporary reflections, or is it just, an acceleration?
I think maybe to bring back maybe the first 2 points, it's interesting. Again, I haven't mapped it out, but you could look at the circulation of media narratives in major newspapers around the world, and you could probably find reference to these types of resistances. Yeah, had become exacerbated in recent times. I would suspect that's the case, but yeah, I haven't done the research, or that's not what I do, I guess.
Thank you.
I of course have a wonderful question, but since our offices are just across from each other, I can spare that. So one last quick question from Ale.
Yeah, since I'm all the way downstairs.
Yes.
We never see each other.
But it's kind of actually picking up on that, the enemies and the sort of hindrances towards cosmopolitan solidarities. I guess like
Yeah.
the whole issue of what to do with refugees, and
Yeah.
this is more of a reflection on some videos of interviews with Danish politicians that I was subjecting myself to over the weekend, where the folk, someone from the Folke Party actually suggested that Denmark should really follow the Australian example of dealing with refugees and political asylum seekers by putting them in Greenland, actually.
Yeah,
That was
offshore.
a suggestion. So it's kind of, on one hand, you have these discourses at sort of the individual, like in the community, and then there's like all these political actors
sure.
which are also playing up on these
Yeah.
fears and anxieties
Definitely.
as well, of course.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely, so that we and we've said it in the papers, but it's hard to remember all this stuff, but we talk about it in terms of how people and theorists themselves, Beck, and other, Beck is notorious for it, but there are others, maybe not in the list I provide because they're some of my favourites, but the way in which individuals and theorists become up and come to reproduce these sorts of discursive binarizations about global life. Chris Rumford, one of the great authors about cosmopolitan spaces and bordering, he talks about precisely what you mentioned about the ways in which national borders have become mobile things. No longer is the Australian border the Australian coast, or same with Denmark. We are able to offshore refugees and so on, and to have these extraterritorial spaces. This is an interesting phenomenon. Perhaps it's always been around, but it's something that's become much more obvious in recent times as nations go to great lengths to make these types of protections, these types of protections against refugees. Not a good answer, but yeah. Have I answered your question? At least
Well, it wasn't really a question.
It wasn't a question,
Yeah.
exactly. So I,
Yeah.
yeah, but you
A
should
long
read,
answer to a long question.
yeah, you should read Rumford's work around mobile borders. This
I
is
will.
interesting way to think about it. But again, I would say there are so many interesting things here, but I'm more interested in everyday practices and particularly everyday discourses and the way in which they circulate and have social efficacy. But that's not to say that the effects of media discourse and so on are not evident. They're clearly evident in the way people are reproducing these types of ideologies about the global. Yeah, and if you go through all the interviews, you'll find references to particular current contexts in the interviews where people use as examples. And so in this sense, like all my research, actually, like many of us here, we're interested in the way in which fantasy and reality interpenetrate, right? The way in which people tell stories. True or false, these stories have a type of political and cultural efficacy. This is where it gets interesting.
And when you actually look at the comments on those YouTube videos where, for example, the Folk Party representative is interviewed by, say, someone from CNN, then you have a lot of commenters from the US who say, finally someone is standing up to the, to those migrants and, this guy. So it's like all this, someone from Denmark talked about Australia and the Americans saying like, that's the way to go, and it's like this sort of global flows of
correct.
all these
Prejudice.
things.
So the question of right-wing movements and how they're globally networked and connected is a really important topic. One of my maybe only PhD student, I think, I supervise in Oslo, is working at the Centre for Research on Extremism. And the University of Oslo have this centre which is devoted to precisely studying the way in which these sort of right-wing movements affect the national in the Norwegian context and maybe Scandinavian more generally. Yeah, it's a hugely important topic. Yeah, it's not what I'm doing. Yeah, but
Talk.
Thank you. I guess that's it then. Thank you for coming, and see you next time. Yes.